the fonts. I'll have to look them up. I think that the S applique is from the Mindy applique font, and I just eliminated the all the Mindy Paisley stuff around it. And then I don't remember the cursive. I'll have to look that up for you. But they're both JuJu fonts, and this is going to be how we make our basket. So here's our supply list for the fabric pieces to make our basket. I'm going to use the chart that was posted in the group. I'll try to remember and put, when we post this video in the group, I'll add the link to the chart or a photo of the chart. But it lists out all the different size baskets or some common size baskets, and it's already got the measurements for you on what the finished size will be and what you need to cut. So we're going to make a 5x7 basket. So we need 2 rectangles cut 11 by 15. And we have those. And that's for the one for the lining. And then we'll need 2 rectangles cut for the outside, the front of your basket, if you will. Then we'll need some interfacing, which is 10.5 by 14.5. I cut it just a smidge smaller, so that there's less fullness inside the seam allowances. We'll need a fold over lip, and so that's going to be about 6 by 30. That is flexible based on the size of basket you have. This is 30 inches long to go all the way around the top of the basket, and then it's 6 inches to give us room to have about 1.5 to 1.75 inch fold over showing here, so that we have about 1.75 1.5 here. And so that is how I calculated the 6 by 30. You can vary this. If you want this a little bit wider, say 2 inches, then you'd want it cut about 7 inches. You can vary that based on what you want it to be. And then of course the length is going to be based on the length of your fabric pieces. You can use your math to figure those out. And then I'm also going to make something different on this basket than what we've been sharing. I'm going to put some handles. So I've cut 3 by 14 piece of cotton fabric that's going to coordinate with our basket. And we're going to sew up 2 of these handles to go on the basket. So they'll actually mount sort of like this to the new baskets that we're going to make. So these can be Easter baskets. Okay. One of the baskets I'm going to make removable. I bought some pretty shiny buttons. So we're going to make one set of the handles removable, and one set is going to be permanently attached. So you'll have some variation as to how you can do this. Plus, JuJu is about to release some adorable in the hoop handles, so you can use some of the same processes, but you'll just make your in the hoop handle separate while you're doing some of your other sewing. Okay, so let's take a look at our list, and I guess I really need to make a correction here because we actually need 4 rectangles, because we need lining and we need the outside fabric. So this is our lining fabric, the sloth. So we have 2 of these cut 11 by 15. And then the outside of our fabric is cut 11 by 15. You'll see they are all 4 the same size. If we lay them all on top of each other, they're all the same dimensions. And for time's sake, I have already pre-cut the corners out. The cutouts for the basket size I'm making are 2.5 by 2.5. So you'll see here, we've cut the 2.5 inch square cutouts. And so that's how we'll make the corners of our basket. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to figure out where to embroider on the basket. That's another big problem that folks are having. they'll either accidentally place it too high or too low. So we're going to talk about trying to find the best way to do this. We're going to take our ruler and we're going to take our fabric marker. We're going to mark approximately where our seams will be. So I use about 1/2 to 3/8 inch of a seam allowance when I'm stitching. So I'm just going to take and make a little couple dots. So I know that's the bottom of the front of the basket, okay? Then we're going to do the same thing with the top. We're going to mark about 1/2 to 3/8 of an inch, so we kind of know where the seams are going to be. That gives us the space in here that we have to work with. Well, then we have to figure out how far down we want the lip. So if your lip is going to be 1.5 inches to 3/4, which is what this one measures, is about 1 3/4 inches, then we need to come down from the seam that far. So that means we're going to lay our ruler on top and we're going to make another couple of dots. We're going to come down from the seam allowance to about 1 3/4 inches. And then we're going to make sure that that's square. You want to cut your corners, cut your lines pretty square so that when you're checking for square, you really are square. Remember, we want a square basket. We don't want it crooked. And the cut lines, if they're crooked, your lines are going to be crooked. So this is going to be the visible part of our basket. Okay, so now we have the top and bottom figured out. Now we have to figure out where the side seams are going to be. So we're going to take our ruler and we're going to use it again to mark the seam allowance. So you're going to be sewing along these cutout lines. So you're going to take and mark your seam allowance in a couple of spots on both sides. Okay, so that gives us this space for the front of the basket. You don't want to fill that completely up with stitching as a general rule, but that gives us an approximate basket space front of 6 by 8. Okay, if you measure that out, we've got a little over 8 inches across, maybe close to 8.5, and then a vertical distance of about 6. So you have about a 6 by 8 space marked off that is available for you to stitch. So it's easy to put some of the gorgeous 5 by 7 designs that JuJu has, as long as they're horizontal. You can do a lot of the 4 by 4. You could do a 6 by 6, a 5 by 5. Lots of designs will fit in this space. Once you find the space you have, you can find the center and place it on your stabilizer by folding in half and then laying it on the hoop. And that's what we're going to do next. And show you how this works. So I have an Innovis NQ 1400E. Sure, I'm all hooked up right here. Let me change the focus. There we go. So, and she likes to sew what I call naked on the end. She seems to shred more and give me trouble if I cover her up over there. So she just doesn't use the cover. But you'll see she's a basic Brother machine, and she's well loved and well used. But we're going to use our touch screen. Whatever machine you have, play with your touch screen. Touch all the buttons that you have and learn what they do. You're not going to mess anything up, but just learn your machine by pressing buttons and playing around. So we're going to show you a couple things. If I touch the paper icon and go over, I can find thread colors. I can find my speed setting. I can find my tension, my foot height. This machine will let me move the presser foot up or down. So there are lots of things inside your touch screen you can play with and figure out what they do. I highly encourage you to do that no matter what machine you have. We're going to load our design by going to the arrows. So for this particular project, if you're a hooper, you could probably hoop this just fine. For time's sake, I have gone ahead and ironed the fusible fleece on the back of the front piece and the back piece of our fabric. I did not put any of the fleece on the lining fabrics, because they're just going to be down inside the basket. So I've ironed these on. I ironed from the front. You don't want to use steam when you use most of your fusible projects like Heat and Bond Light or your fusible fleece. You do want to watch the iron temperature on fleece because it will melt if you use too high of a temperature setting. But I've ironed my fleece on my back. I've located where my center panel will be, and now we're going to locate placement on my stabilizer. I do like, some of you have seen my videos before, I do like marking my stabilizer for ease in finding my centers. Remember that your little divots are not center on many of your hoops, okay? So mine is marked just to the left of my little bars there. You can find center by putting your hoop stabilizer on the machine and dropping the needle. It's always going to be centered. And then you'll make sure that your marks are in the center of your line. So now we have our stabilizer marked. You can kind of see the fold from the center. I'm going to do the same thing, folding top to bottom, but I want to line up pretty close my seams where the top and the bottom are going to be. Move that out of the way so we can flatten you out. So you don't want to press too hard or your lines will stay once you're done. So we're going to fold it over. We are lining up and using straight edges to make sure we're straight. If you cut straight, if you cut square, your straight edges will be straight. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to identify my center spot with that pin. So that's where I want the center to match up on my hoop in the center of my stabilizer. So I'm going to fold it and line up the top and the bottom, and then I'm going to adjust this part to line up on my center, and I'm going to poke that through. I want that to stay put while I pin the rest of my project down. I'm going to find this fold up and down. You can mark these with your marker if you want, but I'm going to make sure it lines up with my black mark and my center mark on my hoop. Okay, we're going to do the same thing with the bottom. So my fold is center. I'm going to make sure it lines up, and it does. So I'm going to pin that in place. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the sides. It looks like my fold, you can barely see the fold. It matches and lines right up with the purple line and my mark. So I'm going to take that pin out of the center, move it over to the side. So if you're a hooper, like I mentioned before, you could probably hoop this. The stiffness of the ironed on fleece is a nice stable support for this project. So it's not completely necessary to pin and baste a whole lot down unless you're using a really thin fabric and a really dense design. The design density, how many stitches are in this space, determine how you stabilize and how well the project is going to respond to that many stitches. So I try to go ahead and pin all the way around. Because I have ironed on fleece attached to my fabric, I really don't want to run a basting stitch because the more things you have to stitch through, the higher the risk that you'll have issues getting all of those needle holes out once you remove the stitches. You could definitely use a basting stitch if you were okay with the work trying to get the holes out. You can usually steam them right out. You can dampen them and finger press and do a little work to get them out. But this project is really pretty easy and straightforward, and it's pretty well stabilized with the fusible fleece on the back. So it's, unless you're using a really dense design or a lot of tiny font words, I think you'll be okay just pinning it. This is still a lot of pinholes to try to get out, but it's still fewer than stitching a basting stitch all the way around. But now this is going to go to the machine, and I'm going to be appliquing on a letter. I'm making Easter baskets for 2 of my granddaughters. So this one is Kenzie's. I'm going to make matching ones, only the lining fabrics are going to be a little different, but I'm going to do an E and Emily on the new one. So this is going to go to the machine, and then we'll be right back. All right, we have our design stitched on the front of our basket. If you wanted to stitch a different design on the back, you would follow all of those same exact steps on the back piece of your basket fabric. You would find the center the same way, mark off your lip edge, your side panels, mark all that off, and then figure out your stitch area and stitch just like we did here. We're going to trim the stabilizer, and I always use cutaway. I mean, I hardly ever use tearaway for much. I love cutaway. I love the support it provides while stitching and afterwards. So now we have this done. What we're going to do next is I'm going to take some dots. I'm going to take this to the kitchen. I'll take some dots of water, and I'm going to cover up, erase all of these marks that are on here. And then after I do that, I'm going to press steam the little holes that my pins left all the way around, but I'm not going to steam the design whatsoever. Never, never, never steam your design. So I will put a little bit of steam all the way around after I get these dots out, and then we're going to start putting our basket together. So we're at the sewing machine. We are going to take our lining fabric, right sides together. I'm going to match the bottom corners first. That way I know I keep my straight edges straight and I don't risk shifting anything. I'm gonna pin a little bit right here. And pin a little bit right here so it stays straight and square. And then I'm going to run stitches down the bottom and the two sides. I am using the edge of my foot as my straight edge, so I am able to keep my seams straight. And then we're going to do the same thing down the sides. All right, so now we have the 3 seams done. We're gonna take this to the ironing board, and we're going to iron all 3 of these seams a little bit flat. So come with me and we'll do that. You can lay the seams over to one side, you can serge these, you can lay them open. It really is your choice how you choose to finish off these inside seams. I am old school. My mama taught me to iron seams open. And yes, I have a serger sitting over there, but sometimes it adds a little bit of bulk to your seams, and we definitely don't want that in our pretty baskets. So whichever way you choose to finish your seams off is fine. You could even do the basket inside seams with a French seam, and then you'll have a pretty finished edge. So to do the bottom, a couple things I do. One is I fold it one way and iron it flat. And then I flip it over and do the other way. So both of the bottoms get creased a little bit. The iron is going to be your favorite master tool for this project because that's how we're going to get such crisp edges. So now we're going to take this back to the machine. We're going to we had it like this. It was a square with our cutouts, and now we're going to take our cutouts and we're going to seal them up. We're going to match up your side seam with your bottom seam. And then we're going to run a row of stitching right down this supposedly straight edge, if I can get it to stay put. And again, I've got my seams ironed open. just going to run, I'm using the edge of my presser foot again. And I'm just going to run that row of stitches right down that straight line. And yes, you do notice I'm reversing and sort of stay stitching most of the starts and stops. That just helps keep your stitches from coming undone. So now we have one corner stitched, and now we're going to do the same thing to the other corner. We're going to open it up and match the side seam at the bottom to the bottom stitch. Okay, see, I'm just going to line it up, and we're going to run that row of stitches right across the same way as we just did. So now back to the iron we go. We're going to iron some seams and corners. So this is the lining. Okay, so it's going to go in the basket, in the bucket, where you can see it. Trying to get my camera focused for y'all. So it's going to go in the bucket this way. So you will be able to see the pretty finished sloths and flowers when we finish. So it's going to get ironed wrong side out. So we're going to take this to the machine. We're going to put a little bit of a crease from the corner of your bottom seam right here. We're going to try to make a straight line, two parallel lines between the fold we're going to iron in and the stitch on the side of the basket. So we're going to try to get that matched up. You can use the top edge of your fabric. If all of your cuts are square, it should line up pretty square. You can also take your quilting ruler and measure to make sure you're pretty close here as well. So we're just going to take and press the corners in here all the way around. We're going to press all four corners. I'm going to use my finger to push the bottom corner out. I'm going to move the bottom fabric out of my way. And we're going to match the fold to the straight edge of the seam pretty close. If you're worried about it, you can definitely put a ruler on it and get it precise. That gives us two of our straight corners. And we're going to do the same thing to the other side. We're going to use our top edge because it's pretty straight. We're going to use our straight edge. We're eyeballing to make sure we're parallel and not wonky. Just a little press gets us a nice firm corner. We do that again on the last corner, pulling all the extra fabric out of the way and lining up. Notice when I lay this down, look right there. You can definitely see this end is wider and it's narrower. So we're going to pull that out a little bit and get it matched up. That does take a little practice, but I've been sewing for 50 years. So it's easy to notice when you've been doing it a while. Sometimes I still goof up and get it wrong. But now we have our inside lining for the basket. Okay? And it's going to collapse because it doesn't have anything really stiff to hold it. But we're going to take this and put it inside our other basket. We have our basket for Emily, and it's still wet where I dotted all of the purple marks off. So we're going to lay this aside, but we once it dries, I will do the same stitches. I'll go across the bottom here. I'll go across the sides, and then we'll match up the corners the same way we did on the lining fabric. We'll stitch across here. Okay. So we'll do the same thing to this once it gets dry. It will come out looking just like this. Okay, so we have Kenzie's lining and basket already made. So we're going to move to her basket. So we have the lining all made, and we have the basket, outer basket, all made and creased exactly the same. So now we're just going to take and insert the basket inside the basket, matching up the corners. And matching up your side seams. Okay, we're going to match the seams and put a little pin here and there. Can't find my corner. There we go. Takes a little wiggling. Then we're going to just go to the other side and do the same thing. We're going to match up our side seams. Drop a little pin there to hold it still. And then I find just holding it up in the air with my fingers underneath, kind of like this, letting it all kind of fit into place helps a little bit. So press your corners into each other. Trim off any excess. Like it does appear that we have a little bit longer lining. That happens. Sometimes the seam allowances are just a bit different. That's okay. We're going to straighten it out and trim it. It's no biggie. The inside does need to be a little smaller. You can trim it from the beginning if you want, or you can wait till this step. But see, now we have our lining down in our basket. Now comes some fun stuff. So I am going to take and I'm going to trim this off right along the top edge. Oops, y'all can't see that. Just trimming right along this edge. It's about 1/4 of an inch that I'm taking off. To match the lining height closer to the outer fabric height. Okay. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to play with our cuff. So what I have already done is I took my 6x30 piece of fabric. I ironed it not quite in half. I left a seam allowance long enough for us to have on the outside of the basket. Remember when we looked at Stone's basket, his comes out. So we have the cuff on the top, but if you turn it up, you can see the seam inside here. This is where we need this extra length on your cuff fabric that you have. I have ironed fleece to the inside. I folded it. I pressed it out flat. I cut my fleece about the 1.5 inches, 1.25 inches, so that it adds a little bit of stiffness to the upper edge of the basket. And then I pressed it back over again. So this is where it gets a little tricky. The fabric I'm using on Kenzie's basket is not directional, but the one I used on Stone's is directional. Stone's, you can tell the ram, the fox, the trees are directional. We want them to be right side up, whether you're looking in the basket or at the basket. And so that is a little bit tricky. When you are cutting and placing your cuff, you just have to take a little extra time to put it on the right direction. So what I recommend doing is taking this and pinning it. We're going to do it a couple different ways so you can see. So we're going to take and we're going to pin it like this. And if I am stitching it here, let's see what happens. So we're going to take and pin a couple of pins so that it looks like it's supposed to look when you're finished. Okay, so if we just pin it this way with the long edge up and we pull the fabric over and we stitch it down, is that going to make your design be right side up? If your design at this point, if you can pin it like this and pull your cuff over and your design is right side up, then that's the way you're going to stitch it. If it is upside down, you need to unpin it and try again. Okay? So you could flip ends, or you may have to completely refold your fabric so that your long end is on the other end. But this is the step you need to spend some time on so that you can play with it. The one I'm doing for Kenzie doesn't matter, but this one it did. But you want it to be, when you're folding it over, you want the extra to be showing. You want this to be the long side that's open to the basket. So when you fold it over, it comes out right. Okay. I know it seems a little cumbersome and complicated, but it's really not. Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to make this one round piece by stitching right across here, and then we can pin it to our basket. Okay, we've got it all pinned around the top. I did have to take a little bit out. My length was just a little bit too long, so I just unpinned it, trimmed it, ran another seam, and now it fits just right. So now I'm going to take this to the machine and we're going to run a row of stitches right around here. All right, I have removed part of my machine to give me room to slide this under. And I'm going to use a slightly smaller seam allowance for here. I'm going to move my edge of my fabric inside my foot just a little bit, and then I'm going to hold nice and tight. As I stitch carefully all the way around. And that gets us our cuff attached. Now, when we turn it, this is what we get. But we want to hide all of these rough, tacky little edges. So we're going to take this to the ironing board and we're going to iron this extra piece that we left as seam allowance. We're going to iron it down all the way around and then iron it again so that the seam is at the top. I'm going to slip this over the end of the ironing board. And I'm going to do this in 2 steps because it's just easier. If those of you that are great with the iron, you could probably do this in 1 step, folding both over at once, but I'm not always that good. So we're just going to iron all of this over. Covering up all the raw edges. And then we're going to do it again, so that all the raw edges get tucked nice and neat. And look, guys, no turning a basket. Isn't that cool? Like, you don't have to fight to turn inside that little bitty hole that's left. And you get your cuff right side up instead of upside down. This does get a little bit thick. If you're using heavy fabrics like some of the duck cloth or the canvases, you may want to trim those seam allowances on the heavier fabrics to be a lot narrower, so you have less bulk here that you have to worry with. Because now it does have a lot of layers in there. Okay, but now we're just going to run this seam through the machine. And then we'll be done with this basket. So we are going to unfold the cuff so that the long pretty edge comes out. We're only going to run the stitching through the bottom part of the basket, not the cuff. Okay? I'm not sure that was clear in my instructions before. So we got our row of stitches done all the way around to seal up all our rough edges. And so now we're going to take all these loose strings off, but our basket is finished. So now we're going to take our cuff and fold it down all the way around. Straightening out your corners that you've ironed and pressed so nice and neat. And now we have a 5x7 and a 6x8 basket that we made and personalized. Ain't that cool? Now we're going to do a couple of fun things, because we're going to put, because these are Easter baskets, we're going to put a handle on Kenzie's basket. Kenzie's is going to be removable. When we do Emily's basket in a minute, we're going to put hers mounted in here for permanent sake. Okay, so Emily's will be secured inside the edge of our cuff, but Kenzie's is going to be removable. No particular reason for that other than I wanted to show y'all 2 different ways to make handles. Okay. So this is Emily's front and back to her basket, all dried and stitched together. See, there's Emily. So we're going to do the same way we did before. we have sewn the bottom of the basket. We've sewn both sides on the sewing machine, and now I'm going to take and sew the corners just like we did. We're going to match the side and the bottom seam. I'm going to pin that in place till I can stitch it. I'm just going to run a straight stitch across there on the sewing machine. And on the other end of the basket, we're going to do the same thing, matching up your seams. And stitch. Okay, so then we will have both of our baskets completed and ready to assemble. So now we have both of the lining sewn and pressed and the basket, the front and back. So we're going to do this the same way. We're going to turn it inside out, and we're going to press the corners just like we did to get the lining of the sloth fabric squared up. Okay, so I'm just using my fingers to press the corners out. And we're going to do just the same way. We're going to start with the bottom. I'm going to match up the corners here. And I'm going to take my really hot iron with the steam turned off. We're just going to press a little bit to get us a nice square corner. We're going to flip it around and do the same thing. No steam, especially with fusible type products. The more steam you use, the more likely it is you'll have really bad puckers. Okay, so then we're going to do the sides, and we're going to take my little quilting ruler. I'm going to show you how to use it. If your edges are square and all your cuts have been square, it should be pretty easy, but you just lay your ruler or tape measure. You could use a hem guide, but you just measure, and we've got a right at 2 3/8, and it's the same on this end as well. Okay, so we're going to press that. I'm going to flip it around and do the same thing all the way around. You can double check your measurements. Yep. The squarer your fabric when you first cut it, the easier it's going to be at this point to finish off your project. That's why I always encourage square cuts and centered embroidery, because if that happens, you're going to get it right. It's going to be right every time. Get it where you can see the seam, otherwise you are likely to get it a little bit crooked. And then we have our basket all nice and squared, ironed up where it'll sit up nice and straight. And then we're going to tuck our pretty sloth and flower fabric right inside, the same way we did Kenzie's. I'm going to shake And then turn it up and match our side seams up just the same way as we did. Now we're going to make handles for the basket. Remember I said I was going to make one handle that's removable. I used the free buttonhole designs that JuJu provided a long time ago when we did, maybe it was towel toppers or the reading pillow. I'm not real sure which project we used first on it, but I just went back to that free design. You can find the buttonhole designs if you don't have them in the announcements post in the Facebook group, the Blessings group. And just scroll all the way down till you find the post that says all the freebies are here. And then all the freebies are in the comments. You'll have to scroll through. There's boatloads. I think there's probably 60 or 70 free posts on that one comment. 70 comments. Blah. 70 comments on that one post with all kinds of free stuff. But the buttonholes are in that design, in that post in the Facebook group. So it started out as a piece of fabric about 3 inches by 14 inches. And I just arbitrarily decided on that based on a practice. I picked up the basket and decided, okay, this looks like a child size handle, and I did it. If you wanted a longer handle for it to go over the shoulder, you could do that, but I just chose about 3 by 14. I ironed on fleece in the middle. It's about a 1 inch wide strip that goes end to end, leaving a little bit off for the seam allowance so it doesn't bunch that up. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and just run a seam right down this middle. And so then when you turn it with the loop turner, this is what you end up with. Your seam is right down the middle on the underside, and then I just tuck a little bit under and use my Steam-A-Seam, Wonder Under, whatever closure you want to use here to iron that shut. Okay, so we have our seam run down the handle, and I'm just going to use my cool little handy dandy loop turner. I'm going to reach right inside here and grab the edge of the fabric and work it girl, work it all the way down. With the fleece, it does make it a little challenging. You could use some other stabilizer or none at all if you so desired. Just working. Oh, and that'll happen. That's why I like my little loop turner. You can reach right back in there and grab another piece. And then we're getting close to the end. And there we go. Boy, that's a chore. But that's why I love my loop turner. It makes for much easier work, even though it's still some work. So then I just finger press the seam to one side so it's nice and even all the way down. I can tell right there it's not. So we're going to flip it so it all stays straight. So now I'm going to take this to the iron and let's iron all this flat. All pressed and ironed, and then we're going to take both ends and tuck it under about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch. I usually use a little tool like my loop turner, my bodkin, the flat end of my scissors, something to kind of press the corners. See how I'm pulling against the corner so that it lays flat instead of bunching up. And then we're going to take a piece of, I think this brand is Seam. I'm going to trim it to fit. We're going to slip it right inside here and go back to the iron. So to create the removable handle, we're going to seal up both ends like I was just showing you with the seam. Okay, and so then we're going to locate the placement on our stabilizer to do our free designs by JuJu buttonholes. So I've marked my centers, and then my design I merged two buttonholes into my frame. I'm trying to show you, see my center mark? I'm trying to line up my 2" right at that dot. So I want to go over, that's going to be where one of my buttonholes lines up, and then I'm going to mark here. I designed them 2 inches apart exactly and centered. So I need to make sure my marks are measured properly on my stabilizer. And then we're going to go about a 1/2 inch above. I'm going to make a couple marks just to give me some landmarks to go by. Can't keep the line straight. Yep, okay. So we have, that is about a 1/2 inch, and we're going to do another 1/2 inch. That's 3/4 of an inch. Going to mark a 1 inch line. So we have about 3/4 and a 1 inch line, and then we're going to do the same thing on the bottom so that we can make sure we get the buttonholes in the right place on the handles. You do have to be really careful, because unless you have a measuring tool that goes all the way down in the hoop, with it leaning, it will be a little bit cockeyed if you're not careful. So measure and mark carefully. Okay, so this is the right side of my stabilizer, and now we're going to pin in place. So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that we folded that under, okay? But this handle is actually going to get sewn in. I'm showing you how to lay this on here. Why don't we use this one instead? So we're going to we know the design is centered on this center mark. So we're going to take and lay the end of our handle on both sides, just to, see if y'all can see that, where my top line is, where my 1 inch mark is. Then we're going to have plenty of space to stitch the buttonhole. We're going to pin this in place. You can see it's centered on the 1 inch line. If you wanted to draw that line all the way out, you could as well. You do want to make sure when you're pinning that you're putting pins carefully so that your machine will not stitch over them. That would not be good. So we're going to put a couple of pins in down here well away from the stitch area. And then we're going to take a little water-soluble stabilizer. And we're going to pin it on top. This will make sure that the presser foot does not snag on your fabric. Plus, it'll help keep everything in place. I'm going to take and very carefully place a pin as far away from the stitch area as I can, just enough to grab the edge of the fabric. See right there? I'm going to do the same thing with the other piece of the handle. I'm going to stretch the water-soluble stabilizer out nice and straight. Let's turn this around where y'all can see it better. Just barely grab the edge and pin. The stabilizer, the handle fabric, and the hoop stabilizer all in one. And then we'll put another couple of pieces, a couple of pins in to make sure everything stays nice and straight. So none of the pins we have should be in the stitch area, okay? If you're worried about these, we can easily pull those out, hold everything in place, and pin again. Okay, same process. We're gonna hold everything nice and tight, slip that pin out, put it right back in. Okay, and this is going to go on the machine to stitch the buttonholes. Okay, that is to make the removable handle. Okay, once you get the buttonholes stitched, you want to very carefully trim your holes open. Now my buttons are a thick glass button. And so they're about an inch long, but I made my buttonhole about 1.5 inches long because it's so thick. A lot of times you can use the same size buttonhole as button, but this one was not going to fit easily in the first place. So I made a much larger buttonhole than I probably needed, but I wanted it to be easy to use. So that's how we make the removable handle. And then I hand sewed the buttons in place. So that gives Kenzie her basket with removable handles. Now for Emily's basket, we're going to take our handle we just made. We just stitched this up, ironed it flat. I showed you how to steam a seam using these, but for a basket with permanent handles, you don't need to steam these. We're going to put them inside our basket with our cuff. We're going to pin it all together. Okay? So before we place our handles, I'm going to show you a little trick. Earlier when I made Kenzie's basket, remember I mentioned I had to trim some off? So we're going to do that this time before we sew, and I won't have to go back and do it again. So we're going to line up the fold with the basket folded in half. And so we're going to leave a little bit of a seam allowance, and we're just going to go right through that and trim that excess off. Okay, that's going to be the seam allowances that we measured, that we had in the basket. But remember, on the basket we have 2 sets of seams, and on the cuff we only have 1. So now we're going to sew this together and pin it around the cuff. So to insert the handle, one of the things you can do is pin everything in place and then fold everything out, the cuff out, and make sure it goes where you want it. But what it should look like is this right here. The top of the handle should be on top when you've got it pinned in place, so that when you unfold the cuff, this stays on top. You don't want this part on top. You want it on the underside of the handle. So you're going to find your center of your basket, and I've kind of got it marked with a pin, and you're just going to slide that handle between the cuff and the basket. Okay, so it goes between the cuff and the basket and pinned in place. Shift it over a little bit. Let's move it back where it goes. I'm going to leave it sticking out a little bit so y'all can see where the handle actually is. Okay, and then you're going to flip to the other side and do the same thing. The handle goes between the cuff and the lining fabric and gets pinned in place wherever you want it. If you wanted your handles to go end to end, you could do the same process there. You would just slip it in the end instead of the front and the back. But I want my pretty little shiny buttons in front. And so we're going to take this to the sewing machine and stitch and finish it out the same way we did Kenzie's. So we have finished the basket. We've gotten the cuff attached, and then I've folded under the rough edges, the raw edges again, and I've got them all pinned. And then you want to pull your handle up. You want to keep your handle with your cuff so that when you get finished sewing, it stays above the basket properly. So now I'm just going to run this seam to finish off these raw edges. So we have the raw edges all turned under, all the way around, sewn down, attached, and then we fold our cuff over. You can take this to the iron and re-iron your corners, because monkeying with it and playing with it like we've sort of softened those corners a bit. So you can take this back to the ironing board and put your creases back in if you'd like. All that's left for me to do now is to sew my cute shiny buttons in place. And then Emily and Kenzie will have matching Easter baskets. Get the light a little bit better for y'all. How cute is that? With permanent handles inside the stitching, and with buttonhole, detachable handles with cute little buttons. This is Jenny Gallagher with Designs by JuJu. Happy stitching!